of the Bible, but the third lesson of the series. We're going to talk about God choosing a people today. So basically it's a lesson covering the history of the rest of the Old Testament. So it's going to be a flyby of maybe 20,000 feet today. And you might see a few critters down there, but that's about it. But it's going to be a kind of a covering the rest of the New Testament, or Old Testament. So we're going to start off with Noah, Abraham. We're not even going to talk about David today. Really the prophets, very little. So it's just going to be kind of a big overview of the Old Testament. A couple questions that we're going to deal with today. Number one is, how can a God be a God of mercy but also be just? A lot of times in our minds, mercy and justice seem like polar opposites. But God is both. And so how does that work? To be both a God of mercy but also be a God of justice. Number two is, what is faith? And then number three, what are the bases for God's law? And we're going to hit that a little bit this week, but that's more next week. I will be covering the basis for God's law. Where we left off last week, first of all, God's people were in active mutiny to God. They were rebelling against their king creator. God placed sanctions on his people, called them back to their creative purpose of reflecting and representing the divine. Reflecting is, you could probably lump it in with the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, reflecting God, but representing God as God's deputy rulers here on earth. That's what we were created for. When we do that, we fulfill our creative purpose, and then we have real life purpose. Remember, there's a couple questions that everybody has called worldview questions. First one is where I came from. Covered that last week. Second one is, why am I here? What is my purpose here? And the Bible also gives a clear reason for why we are here. We were created to reflect and to represent the divine. So we're going to jump in with Noah. And today I have a lot of biblical text up on the screen. I think I have about 27 slides or so. So there's quite a few slides, but most of it's just text that we're going to read and then reflect on a little bit. So Noah, this is in Genesis chapter 6, I think it is. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart were only wicked or only evil all the time. So he saw everything they thought about was evil. Can you imagine being living in a culture where everything you think about is the opposite of what God wants you to think about? Maybe South Florida's culture is getting close to that, at least some portions of it, that every thought is polar opposite to what God would have us think. And hopefully not in this group, but I know some people that their thoughts are polar opposite to what God's thoughts are. Then the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on the earth had corrupted their ways. Okay, we've got a couple things here, and there's some other areas we could read more of it, but this is what we're going to read today. First of all, man was completely corrupt. Their hearts were evil all the time. Every inclination of their heart was evil. Polar opposite to what God wants. That's where they were at. Maybe a little bit like South Florida, or like some other cities that we come to. But yeah, either your hearts are turned towards God or away from God. And these hearts were turned away from God, corrupting everything that God had. Second, God regretted that he made man. Can you imagine making something and then regretting that you made it? That's kind of a tough place to be. I put a kitchen yesterday, and I moved the fridge in, and immediately I regretted buying that fridge because the fridge is too big for the spot. It doesn't look good. I wish I would have got a narrower one they call it a counter depth fridge. It would look a lot better. I regretted I bought that fridge. Now, I didn't regret everything about my day, everything about my work of the day. It was just a small regret, which I would have bought a different fridge. But God regretted everything he had made. Regretted that he had made man. But in the contrast that, great in that God had made man, there is one man, Noah was a righteous man. Noah found grace in the sight of the Lord, it says in some translations. So you have this extremes. Most of the people are polar opposites to God, but one man and his family is following God. Finally, God declares the days of sanctions are over and declares the war of rain. Now, if you're humans and you want to declare war on somebody, you have different ways of waging war. But if you're God, you have very different ways of waging war. You don't shoot off missiles if you're God. You have more effective means, like rain, like fire. I mean, you can do things if you're God that humans can't do. So he declares the days of sanctions are over. I've tried to call you back to me long enough with sanctions. It has not worked. Now he's declaring the war of rain. And you can read that in Genesis 6:17. In the 600th year of Noah's life, this is the war account of it, or at least part of it. On the 7th day of the 2nd month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. But God remembered Noah, and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. The King James says the waters assuaged, which receded where they recede to. Assuage just kind of means it's an old English word, mean they just kind of grouped or disappeared into groupings. So receded is a decent translation, but they went away. Where'd they go? Well, into the oceans. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of heaven had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. And the water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. Now, Friday I was in Home Depot, and just as we were getting in, we saw a storm rolling in. It was coming across the parking lot, as they do down here. And they're about 100 yards away, and okay, let's get in very quickly. So we got in, it was just starting to drip. But it probably took 2 minutes to come across 100 yards. And that was an indication of what the storm was going to be like. It was down in the Oakland Park, Home Depot. We were in there for maybe 30 minutes, and it just dumped it. So we got out, the parking lot was all flooded. Some of the areas of the parking lot had about 6 to 8 inches of water in it. Most of the parking lot had at least a little bit of water in it in 30 minutes. Can you imagine what happened if that would have went on for 40 days and 40 nights? I think we would have had a deep rain here, deep water.
Worse than March.
Yeah, worse than March. So this flood was a real flood. Adding to it, you have the fountains of the deep. So you have geysers coming out and flooding the earth. So yeah, it was a very turbulent time. When God wages war, he doesn't mess around. It's not this politically correct war. No, when he wages war, he wages war. And he defeats all of mankind in 40 days and 40 nights. Except for his one man and his family who was on the ark, Noah. After Noah comes off the ark, God said to Noah and his sons with him, I will now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds and the livestock and all the wild animals, all those who came out of the ark with you. Every living creature on earth, I will establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you. A covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in its clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over this earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will all the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. So, a little bit later, Noah is ordered to multiply and care for his washed world. Noah is now the sole, Noah and his family are the sole representatives and reflectors of God. And just like Adam and Eve were given the task of caring for God's creation, they're now given the task of caring for the cleaned up, the washed creation. Now, don't expect that this is going to be a Garden of Eden like Adam and Eve had. No, this is a battlefield. Battlefields are not clean. There's probably carcasses laying all over, piles of bones laying all over. Probably not a lot of plants growing. It was not a pleasant place, probably, that they walked off the ark into. But they were given the task of managing this washed and flooded world. God declares that the war is over. He's hanging up his archer's bow in the sky. Now, when we talk about rainbow, a lot of times people think of that as either a symbol that we're not going to talk about today, or a pleasant thing. But in God's eyes, this is a weapon. It's an archer's bow. And he hangs it up on the hook on the sky and says, I'm done waging war with this. I don't need this anymore. I'm not going to use this anymore. That's the picture that God's giving. And he's saying, I'm going to hang it up there, so when it rains, I will see it and remember. Not you will see it. Notice back here it says, I will see it. Where's that button there? And remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures. Not that we will see it, but it's a reminder to God. That's interesting. He puts the rainbow there to remind himself of the terribleness of the flood, and that he's not going to wage war with water anymore. Okay, moving on. We're going to skip over a couple stories. The Tower of Babel comes in here. We're going to skip over that one. You have, what's the guy's name? Mighty hunter who wages a kind of, not Lamech, Nimrod. There's a short little story about Nimrod, and he builds a city, and it becomes Tower of Babel probably. We're going to skip over all that. We're going to go to Abraham. For the first 12 chapters in the Bible, 14 chapters of the Bible, it is very, very slow. Possibly a couple thousand years are covered in a few chapters. And then we come from going really fast over everything to just slowing down. And for the rest of the Bible is maybe, it's hard to nail down for sure, but somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 years, up to the Old Testament, and that's covered in the rest of the Old Testament. So you have 12 chapters about possibly a couple thousand years, depends, we don't really know. And then it just slows down, and we cover a lot more detail. So we're getting to Abraham slowing down. The Lord said to Abram and Abraham are the same person. God changes his name to Abraham at some point, just for clarity. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your people and your father's household to the land I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation or people. And I will bless you, and will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on the earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. Okay, a couple things here. Verse 12, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your people to the father and your father's household to the land I will show you. The first thing that he says I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a land. Land, a place, a home, a place to dwell in. Now, the location of this land, we're going to have a full map very soon here, but it's kind of in the center of the known world. So and it still is. Israel is still the center of the three continents, pretty much. Geologists argue about which continent it's actually on. They call it the Middle East for a reason. It kind of borders three different continents. The sea is to the west. Here, I'll just pull it up here. You have the sea right here is the land. You have the sea to the west, desert to the east. Up in here is Mesopotamia. You have, that's one big, kind of say, cultural center or powerhouse during the time of Israel. Down here in Egypt, you have another big cultural center or powerhouse. This is kind of the known world at this time. Now, I think they were going down to Africa more, possibly up into Europe. Up in here is Europe. Maybe, quite possibly, some had gotten over as far as Asia. We don't really know time frames and all this. There's different ideas on this. But this is kind of the cultural centers of the world at this point in time. And where does God put them? God puts them right in the middle of these two cultural centers. Right in the middle here. For a couple of reasons. Number one, these countries are constantly trading, and so if you want to put somebody on display for the world to find out about you, if you put them right between the traders, the truck drivers like to talk. I don't know if you know any truck drivers, but they like to talk. They like to tell you about their experiences. And these truck drivers are going to be coming down through here. They're driving camels, not trucks, but they're coming down through here all the time, and they'll go back talking about the things they had seen in Israel. So if you put somebody right here that represents you, everybody in the whole world is going to find out about you. So that's one key reason why he put them there. There's another key reason is they were going to have to trust God. Because these two centers, powerhouse centers, were constantly bickering back and forth too, as world powers tend to do. And if you're caught right in between them, you're going to have to trust God for protection. Because right now, two world powers are bickering, and they're bickering over Ukraine. Russia wants Ukraine, the U.S. wants Ukraine free. And so there's a mighty war going on in Ukraine between in many ways, two power brokers. It's a dangerous place to be. If you're right in the middle of world conflicts, that's not a very safe place to be. So God puts them there so that the whole world can find out about them. He puts them there so they'll have to trust in him. But another thing that happens with being in the trade centers is you tend to have a lot of wealth coming into your area. And so as the traders come through, the truck drivers spend money, and they spend money here, and then they come back and they spend more money here. And soon this area here becomes a very influential and affluent area. God put them in a good land, a good place, but also a very dangerous place. A couple other things. You have the coolest breezes coming off the Mediterranean most of the time. You have it off here. And God told them later on, but it was when the wording that I used later on was a reminder. So he told them earlier too, that I will send the rains if you trust in me. And if you don't trust in me, then I'm going to turn the winds around. They're going to come from the desert, and it's going to be dry, hot, and a famine starting. So they were built with a built-in barometer. You could say a conscience, but a little bit different. You felt it. If it's hot and dry, you knew you weren't following God right. And if it was raining, you knew you were following God well. Wouldn't that be neat? You could just step outside and say, okay, how's my relationship with God today? I think it's pretty good. Better watch out, man. Something's wrong here. They had this built-in barometer. Anytime you hear about famine or east wind or anything like that in the Bible, that should cue your mind that something's not right. God is reminding them, your relationship with me is not right. You need to take care of this. I think that's everything I want to cover on that slide there. But this is an important reminder here that he was put them at a certain place for a reason. This land wasn't for a reason. And they had this built-in barometer to tell them how the relationship was with God. Second part of the Abrahamic covenant is I will make you a great nation or people. He says, I will make your seed as great as the stars in the sky. You won't be able to count them. And has he not ever done that? Is the Jewish people today try to count them? It's not going to happen. They're scattered around. There's no way anybody can count the Jewish people in an accurate count. It's impossible. Just like you can't count the stars. The more you look, the more you see. And it's impossible to count. So I'm not saying, I don't think he says there's going to be as many Jewish people as what there are stars, but just like the stars, you won't be able to count. The third part of the blessing was, I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on the earth will be blessed through you. That's the three parts of the Abrahamic covenant. So you have land, seed, and blessing. One of my college courses, we had to be able to spit that out at any point in time. He said in class, land, seed, and blessing. Land, seed, and blessing. And it was on the test, and he wanted to make sure we had that down. But the three parts of the Abrahamic covenant is land, seed, and blessing. And you see those three parts come up multiple times in the rest of the Old Testament. So the call of Abraham. Abraham obeyed, he packed up and left just as God had commanded. Faith is obedience. Faith is not simply, you can't say, oh, I believe, and do nothing about it. If I had this chair here, and I asked Robert, would you sit in this chair? Do you think it's going to hold you? And he said, sure, it will hold me. I said, well, sit down. Well, shuffles his feet a little bit. He doesn't have faith the chair is going to hold him. If he has faith, he will sit down. Faith is knowledge, understanding, belief put to action. And if you go to Hebrews 11, you'll see that very clearly. It's never just a simple belief. It's a belief put to action. Belief plus faith equals righteousness. And that's another theme that you see through Abraham and also into the New Testament. Belief plus faith, or turns into faith, puts to action, that equals righteousness. If you believe but you don't act, you're not righteous. The Bible is fairly clear on that. Important notes from Abraham's life. Chapter 12, verse 8, Abraham proclaimed the name of the Lord. He built an altar and proclaimed the name of the Lord. He does this a number of times. He is actively reflecting and representing God. He's saying this altar is to God, the God I follow. and he proclaims the name of the Lord. Chapter 15, verse 6, Abraham believes God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Righteousness is a product of faith. You believe God, you have faith in God, you are righteous in his sight. And in 15, verse 16, this is a little, something that most people miss out on this, but read it sometimes. Chapter 15, verse 16. God slows down Abraham's conquest of the land of Canaan because the sin of the Amorites was not yet complete. There was still some righteousness in the land of Canaan. There was still some people that lived in this area that were still God followers. Now, who were these people? Well, we know one name is Melchizedek. It was a God follower that lived in here. Oops. Somewhere in here, Melchizedek lived. There's probably others too. But God slowed down Abraham's conquest into the land because the sin of the Amorites was not yet complete. He was still working with sanctions, calling people back to him. He's not declaring war on the Canaanites yet. He will, but not yet. He's still calling them back to him with sanctions. He is a God of mercy. He gives people time, gives people more time, hoping they will turn around and follow him. He will increase the sanctions to try to call them back. He will decrease the sanctions if they're moving closer. He doesn't go out with justice and war immediately. He gives time. That's something to keep in mind with God's image. They were saved for a few hundred years simply because of the righteousness of a few. Until later on, they are defeated. During this time of waiting for the Amorites, calling the Amorites back to him, if you're here Wednesday nights, we've been going through all this. Abraham's grandson Jacob, there was a drought. Well, why? That should tell us something. There's a drought because they're not following God the way they're supposed to be. They moved to Egypt where there was food and lived there. This is during the time of Joseph, lived there for about 400 years. Numbers in the Bible don't translate well, or any old documents don't translate well. Authorities on the subject say anywhere between about 280 years to about 480 years is the time that they were in Egypt. And it kind of depends which text you're going off. But we're going to say about 400 years. That's the number the Bible often puts in as 400 years. Just keep in mind, numbers do not tend to translate from one language to another language very well. Eventually, they became so numerous that the Egyptians felt threatened, and they enslaved them. Children of Abraham called out to God, and he rescued them through a series of plagues. We're not going to get through all the plagues, but the last plague, God sent an angel to kill the firstborn son of every household in Egypt. Except, he told the children of Abraham to kill a lamb and use the blood to paint the doorpost, the door, and the lintel up top, and then the angel of death would pass over that house. This is the origin of the Jewish holiday Passover. We still have Passover today. God passed over, the angel of death passed over that house, and the oldest in that house was saved. So the Egyptians all lost their oldest son. The Hebrews, the children of Abraham, did not, because they obeyed God and put this blood on the doorpost. Now, was there possibly some Egyptians that followed? Maybe there was, we don't know. But by and large, the Egyptians lost their firstborns while the Hebrews were saved. The children of Abraham were saved. So God led them out of Egypt, into the wilderness, through this. When this happens, the Pharaoh says, get out of here. They head off into the wilderness. And he brought them to the mountains of Sinai, where he taught them about his law and how they were to obey him and represent him to the nations of the world. We're going to cover this next week, so we're not going to go into this much. Where is the mountains of Sinai? We don't know for sure. But somewhere in that lower peninsula of the Sinai Peninsula, there's a bunch of mountains down there, a couple of different places that we think it might be, but somewhere down in there is where God took them so that he could teach them about himself. And we'll get into that next week, but there's about 3 books that God is teaching them about himself in the wilderness. Moving on to Joshua's time. They went through the wilderness. Now God is saying, now go into the country of Canaan, the region of Canaan. First of all, you must destroy them totally. He says, God is declaring war on the Canaanites now. He says, Israelites, you're going to be my weapons this time. Last time I used water, now I'm going to use you. It's time for these Canaanites to be totally destroyed. Just like the people in those times, now it's their turn. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters or their sons to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons. The sanctions were over for the Canaanites. God has tried long enough to call them back to him. They did not obey, so he's now declaring war. While God is a God of mercy, he has had mercy on the Amorites and the Canaanites for 400 years, give or take. At some point, he is going to say, enough is enough, and now we're declaring war. He's also a God of justice. So he declares war on the Canaanites using the children of Abraham to do it. God also gave them a warning. Number one, if you fail to obey the commandment to totally remove the Canaanites, it will result in they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. And the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. It's a warning. Destroy them. If you don't obey me, I will destroy you. So there's that warning there. And then also a warning in the face of victory. It's Deuteronomy 8. If you ever forget the Lord your God and follow other gods and worship and bow down to them, I testify against you today that you will surely be destroyed. Like the nations the Lord destroyed before you, so you will be destroyed for not obeying the Lord your God. So it's a warning. I'm putting you in there. You're there to represent me, to reflect me. But if you do not represent and reflect me, I'm going to remove you and destroy you. God did not want to have a people called by his name in the crossroads of the nations that were not reflecting him. He said, I will destroy you, I will remove you from that land. I'd rather have the land barren and nobody living there than somebody living there that's not reflecting me, especially when they're called by my name. But, as people often do, they become more and more corrupt. And the children of Israel were the same. They did not heed God's warning and chose to follow the gods of pleasure and self-gratification. You know, the Canaanites had this whole religious system set up, focused around pleasure. Can you imagine forming a religion about pleasure? I don't think people do that today anymore. I mean, you look at the sports world, you look at entertainment, they don't form religions around pleasure, but they will give everything they have for that. They will represent that, they will reflect that. They form a religion around pleasure. That's naturally humankind, probably. Humankind that wants to walk away from God often forms their religions around pleasure. They declared mutiny against God, children of Abraham, and God no longer had a witness in the crossroads of the world. He now had somebody who said they were followers of Jehovah, said they were followers of God, but they were not. So he sent times of drought to call them back to him. Remember, drought should cue you in that something's not right. It didn't cue them in. He sent prophets with a message to repent before it was too late. This again, they still did not heed. Early on, prophets came, they would heed for a little bit, but pretty soon they just killed the prophets or got rid of them. Then he sent raiding bands to show them that he had removed his protection. For that, any raiding bands that came into the country were quickly defeated. But he was saying, I'm removing my protection from you. You're on your own if you don't turn back to me. Finally, he sent the Babylonians and Assyrians to remove them out of the land. God could not tolerate people who were called by his name, defaming his name to the nations of the world. I think that's a lesson for us today, too. The church, by and large, people who claim to be followers of God are defaming his name. And God's not going to tolerate that. It's one thing for a heathen to defame God's name. It's another for somebody who is called by God's name to defame his name. God will not tolerate that. So he took them into captivity, taken captivity for 70 years. That 70 years it's interesting, they were supposed to have a feast every 7 years, and they did not have that feast. And so finally God said, for every year you do not have this feast, and a year of sabbatical, I am going to take you into captivity. So rather than have your sabbaticals spaced out, I said 7 years, 50 years. Rather than having your sabbaticals spaced out like you're supposed to, you're going to get them all at once. 70 years you're in captivity as my land rests. They had learned the lesson well while they were in captivity. They learned not to intermarry with others, not to follow the heathen gods all around them. Instead, they became a holy people. People separated God. They wanted to stay away from everything that was corrupt. They wanted to follow God with everything they had. But this following God soon turned into, I will stay away from corruption. I will stay away from anything that has a possible evil intent. I will separate myself. Over time, the change of focus became an idol in itself. When we get to Jesus' time, this idea of separation became their God. Instead of representing God, they became separate from the nations and became their God. They forgot the true meaning of the law of God. They forgot how to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And is replaced with a paranoia of anything that could defile them. You know, there's many people who have this paranoia today. And we probably know somebody that I'm not going to get close to that because it's going to be evil. No, that's a paranoia. Now, I'm not saying we should walk in sin and deal and rub shoulders with sin all the time, but let's not think that our relationship with God is based only on avoiding what is wrong. It also has to be following what is right. I think I told you this illustration early on when we got here, but a number of years ago I was riding a bike through a tunnel, and I couldn't see anything. I didn't have a flashlight, and it was pitch black, and it was a paved roadway, and if you can't see when you're riding a bike, it becomes kind of hazardous very quickly. And I noticed that I could hear the walls of the tunnel, and I could tell which side I was getting closer to, which wall. And so I could simply correct the steering and go back until I hear that wall, and then correct the steering. And in the middle of it is a paved with like a crack in the middle of the concrete. It was a 2-lane highway that used to go through there. And I could feel my wheel crossing that crack, and I was hitting it like this. And as I kept riding, it dawned on me that I'm just avoiding the walls. I'm not necessarily trying to get to the tunnel anymore. My focus has been on don't crash into the walls, don't crash into evil, don't crash into walls. And so I thought there has to be another way. I stopped and think a little bit. And I noticed way out, about a mile away, I could see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I thought, I wonder if I can concentrate on that light and get to the tunnel without crashing. So I wish I would have had ear protection to drown out that sense. I didn't. But I just focused on that dot of light way down there and started riding. And I noticed now my wheel is not going hitting that crack like this. It's just barely crossing the crack. I'm riding almost a perfectly straight line. Can't see anything. Can't see the ground. Can't see anything except for this little dot of light a mile away. A couple of things remarkable is my eyes are 2.5, 3 inches apart. On a triangle to a dot a mile away, that's a long skinny triangle. But my brain could compute enough to keep me going straight. That's an amazing, powerful brain that God has given us. Number 2, as I thought about this, if I would have lost a moment of concentration and crashed into a wall, I am not a failure at that point. When I was trying to avoid the walls, if I crash, I'm a failure. I failed, I'm defeated. But now, my focus is not just avoiding the walls, but getting to the tunnel. Not just avoiding sin, but following God. And so I crash, I pick my bike up, keep going. I'm not defeated. They had lost the concentration of focus on following God, and it went to just avoiding sin. Don't fall in the left-hand ditch, don't fall in the right-hand ditch. Just avoid sin. And that's the trap they fell into during his captivity. Okay, let's look at the Abraham covenant. How did it turn out for him? The land. They got as much of the land as they had faith to take. Now, God gave them the borders that they were supposed to have. And some people will argue about whether he will still give them the borders. I don't know. I'm going to stay neutral on that. But I will say this much. They got as much of the land as they had the faith to take. When they were following God, they had faith, they believed him, they acted upon it. They got as much of the land as their faith would give them. The descendants, they did become a great nation. Try counting them. Good luck. Not going to happen. Blessing. What was promised to Abraham is that they would have to wait a bit longer for this blessing. They didn't have it yet. Because Abraham's children's unfaithfulness. But God is not finished with the story yet. God is in it for the long term. One thing we all forget about God is God is in it for the long term. We think he's going to come through now. He might. But following God is not a short-term proposition. It's long-term. And he's not going to let man's schemes derail his plans. The blessing will come. They don't have it quite yet in the Old Testament. Looking forward, next week we're going to look at God's law, or the roadmap for our lives. Now, a lot of times people look at laws and rules, and we have a kind of negative connotation of laws and rules. But it's also a roadmap, or you could say an owner's manual. The other day, the seat heater on our van stopped working. No, it stopped working. It stayed on all the time. And in South Florida, you don't really want a heated seat. Okay, so I saw it's a bad switch. Now, I could replace this switch, but I'll never need heated seats down here. I just need to kill the power to that thing. And I was trying to find the fuse box. I could pull the fuse. I don't need heated seats down here. Pull the fuse and be done with it. I couldn't find, I found a fuse box, but there's no directory in the fuse box of what the fuses were. So what I go to my owner's manual, my roadmap. Now you can look at it, it tells you all kinds of things you should and you should not do in that book. And you can look at it and think, this is restricting. But really, it's kind of informative. It tells you how to operate this vehicle correctly, how to fix it correctly, how to find the things in this vehicle you need to operate. It's kind of helpful. That's what God's roadmap is too. His law is to give us the information we need to live our lives. That's the overview of the Old Testament in, 25 minutes? Like I say, there's a lot of things we missed, but it's the general theme of man not following God, God working through either sanctions or war, giving his law, explaining to mankind how to follow him. Sometimes they did it well, sometimes they did not do it well. Well, I'm thankful that God uses Jewish people, Hebrew people, instead of Germans. Because Germans, they don't really show emotion much. They just kind of, I can say because I'm kind of part German, they don't really show emotion much. They just kind of do what they need to do and pull yourself up by bootstraps and make it happen. And I can imagine, instead of falling into worshiping other gods and offering sacrifice to other gods, sometimes they're even their own children, instead of doing that, they would have just not read their Bible that morning. We wouldn't have anything to write about. But because he used the Hebrew people, it's a very graphic illustration of when they followed him, then he sent rain. And when they did not follow him, they were following idols. It's easy to see they're not following God, and God sends drought. Sanctions come, and they turn back to God, the sanctions leave, and the sanctions come back when they fall away from God. And at the very end, God eventually declares war. He declared war in Noah's time. He declares war on Sodom and Gomorrah. We didn't really cover that. He declares war on the Canaanites. And eventually he declares war on his own people because they did not follow him. His own people are really no different than his people before his people. Adam and Eve, Noah, some of his others, they were his people too, and they rebelled against God. The Canaanites were his people. He created them, but they rebelled against God. They were not following him. Eventually he declares war. Now, I have a theory that as long as there is a candle of righteousness in a town or in a city or in a nation, God will continue to go with sanctions. But at some point, there is no possible way for that little child to find out about God. Because every candle, every light about God, every witness of God has been extinguished. And at that point in time, God says, instead of continuing with sanctions because they're not going to work, because there's no way for them to come back to me, because there's no way for them to find out about me, instead of continuing with sanctions, now we're going to stop all future generations to be born. We're not going to leave this carnage continue. A nation or a people that does not follow God is not a happy, beautiful place to be in. It's a very destructive, evil place to be in. And eventually God says, I will stop the carnage because these people have no chance to follow me. The sin of the Amorites is complete. There's no one that follows me. I will cut them off and let some other people come in and take over. Does God still do that today? I don't know, but I suspect he does. We might not see it because we live in the short term, God lives in the long term. But I suspect he still does sometimes. Says, okay, there's no more hope here. And I will now declare war. As long as there's hope, God uses sanctions. But when the hope is gone, then he declares war. And he wipes his people off. That is the story of the Old Testament in a nutshell. We're going to get to the law next week, and then we're going to jump into the New Testament. We'll be in the New Testament for the final 3 weeks, I think it is. 1, 2, 3 weeks, yeah. 3 weeks, 4 weeks? I forget. 4 weeks maybe it is. So we're going to go into the Old Testament very quickly. The New Testament will slow down even more. So, are we doing communion next? And then we will go to discussion.